Okay, so a while back I decided to let you, the non fans or even casual fans, in on the nuances that make pro wrestling so fascinating. I took a slow and steady approach in which I elaborate on each specific aspect of pro wrestling, like character arcs and wrestling fans. It's a long term format I have devised to delicately create a slow burn of excitement and investment before I pick on an actual wrestling match that you can tolerate. Hence, you might be confused that my next video straight out the gate talks about the greatest wrestling match ever. And I feel there's some kinds of disclaimers I need to put out.
Hold up a minute, player.
So, first off, I'm experimenting with a few different concepts, and this is one of them, I suppose, where I give out an opinion piece rather than a usual video essay. So, this video is not a part of the Bizarre Appeal series. Second, at first glance, this might seem a little too niche, inclined more towards the wrestling community, which, to be fair, is true to an extent. But if I have managed to open up at least one tiny artery into your heart hole to give it a shot, I promise there's going to be something for you too in this video. And lastly, it's crazy, even stupid, narratively speaking, if I try to speak about the greatest wrestling match ever or even any wrestling match, much less break it down without speeding through all of the context behind the art. Which is why I am going to be talking about the greatest wrestling match to not even be a wrestling match. Let's start with some background.
Welcome to what we believe will be the greatest wrestling match ever.
The story going into the WWE Summer Pay-Per-View Backlash for Randy Orton and Edge is for the most parts endearing, both with a long history of being partners to being rivals, to one of them having to retire from a serious neck injury unceremoniously in heartbreaking fashion in 2011. Edge made a triumphant return to in-ring action after 9 years of being put on the shelf in January of this year, entering into the annual Royal Rumble match to a thunderous ovation by the fans. WWE booked a safe first feud for him with a veteran and a decent wrestler, Randy Orton, post-return, where Randy plays a natural heel of the two, the bad guy, if you didn't know. Now, the first of the context for a particular match happening the way it happened is the pandemic putting a halt to the seismic plans heading into WrestleMania 36. Instead of going on hot into an arena filled with an energetic crowd dying to see a fan favorite make a return to wrestling after a really good build-up over the weeks, the two eventually had to put on a match in an empty building carrying out stunts with silence in the background. It wasn't a bad match, but the consensus of the fans and reviewers alike was that it was 20 minutes too long for a match with no wrestling fans to follow the beats, as I've already discussed in my video essay explaining the role of the fans. Insiders claiming that the match, having been pre-taped beforehand, there was no reason for not cutting it down to an action-packed 15 minutes, instead of dragging on for 36 minutes. This being the second of the contexts. After WrestleMania, while the empty arena TV shows had been doing okay, declining ratings and direct competition from the young promotion AEW, that had started using the wrestlers from its own locker room as live crowd for the shows, basically led WWE to follow those steps and stage trainees and recruits from their own performance center as the crowd. Now here's my 2 cents about the difference in treatment of the agenda between the two companies, which plays into my take on Randy vs Edge. The crowd in AEW have or are allowed to have personalities. For example, there's a heel side of the arena and a babyface side on the other end, and the wrestlers or staff members on either side will behave in a way that accentuates their characters. People would be allowed to record from their point of view with commentary and put it up on their social media.
This is crazy. I'm gonna win so much money. Dude, shut up.
And can start creative chants. The performers inside the ring will even play off the crowd members to further their storylines. And granted, most of the crowd consists of TV performers who have their own gimmicks, unlike WWE, where the crowd consists of people who have had very little to no screen time in front of the actual audience. That being us. But that does very little to change the fact that both the companies function off of their own ethos. WWE, in comparison to AEW, will have a rather staged crowd that cheers when asked to cheer and boo when told to boo. There are clear instructions given to them. There's no concept of two opposite sides of a crowd because all the members will react in a desired way to the performers. And that, for the most parts, is not true of an actual audience. They will cheer for whoever they like, doesn't matter if they're heels or faces. And with that context out in the open, I'll move ahead into briefly going over the story of the match being set. So after defeating Orton in a last man standing match, Edge is confronted again by Randy about being able to defeat him in a match type with super lenient rules, and that Edge, with 9 years of ring rust, would not be able to hang with someone like Orton in a straight up no gimmick wrestling match. Edge accepts, and this is hastily marketed as a
Greatest wrestling match ever.
It's tacky, but it's also smart. For the scores of casual fans that would likely type up best wrestling match or something, will most likely be shown these keywords on search, and for their supposed lack of knowledge into the world of wrestling, would to be fair, believe what they see. So, good PR. And there was considerable hype and impossible expectations built up going into the said match that was criticized and made fun of by both participants on social media. And then, the match happened, and I was excited. And what I saw was great. So great, in fact, that on a deeper level, I felt somewhat cheated. I wish there was a better word. This had no right to be what it turned out to be. And for it to be compared with any other match, much less the greatest wrestling match, is a bit unfair. This match, like the WrestleMania match, was taped weeks in advance, and there were already reports floating about how recording would pause to have them do certain spots better, and how the final product was heavily edited down. Added to that were actual stock audio tracks of a stadium crowd being played over the match to give it a feeling of an organic crowd, on top of which was the cherry, this camera angle. Pro wrestling traditionally works on the phenomenon of suspension of disbelief. It states that we would intentionally avoid critical or logical thinking in examining art for the sake of being entertained. It's why we could enjoy a wrestling match without getting into the nitty gritties. But it's real goddamn hard to suspend one's disbelief when one of the cameras supposed to be capturing a combat sport cuts under the two wrestlers performing a hold. It made me snap out of it, to be honest. Something else that annoyed me, and I gave context for, is the audience. Halfway through the match, there were crowd chants like "This is awesome." But because I know how WWE places these chants like a script, my enjoyment felt kinda forced. I know that unlike AEW, this crowd was specifically told to chant something at the right time, which makes it a bummer. The match being edited down to perfection makes it a great movie perhaps, but not a wrestling match. Brian Alvarez of Wrestling Observer newsletter, one of the harshest critics of WWE in my opinion, defended the match by alluding to a past when match choreography, a staple of wrestling today, was seen as a negative by the gatekeepers of traditional wrestling. I find it hard to agree for the simple reason that this format could never become the norm in wrestling, in the vein of choreography. If not for the bizarre circumstances that we live in today, this can never be the norm because in front of an actual wrestling crowd, achieving this is impossible. How is a cameraman gonna climb under two performers in an actual live setting? I guess my main beef with the match is the simple fact that WWE did its most convincing jobs in years in trying to book a perfect match. Because like I said, it only took a second thought to even break away from the illusion I was being fed. That how unfair would it be to compare this to a match, say Okada vs Omega, an actual live, uninterrupted, hour-long match in front of an actual crowd. And those who have seen my Wrestling Fans Explained video will know how passionately I adore cinematic matches. Randy vs Edge is a cinematic match that with the help of brilliant editing and finesse pretends to be a live match. And that is unfair to even the smallest of matches that are not afforded this luxury. In conclusion, a lot of reviewers I look up to had decided to rate the match and the performance normally, but no matter how much I try to remove this pair of perhaps traditional lenses, I cannot seem to. And it's not a criticism for Randy vs Edge or even the stage crowd. The performance still had the same amount of risk involved, with Edge sustaining a tricep injury while performing a retake. There's quite literally nothing out of bounds when it comes to wrestling. This match has a place in wrestling, like a lot of other things. It's a huge umbrella, this art form. If not for the advantages or the marketing and the different contexts that I talked about, my opinion might have been different. But for now, I believe that in fact, the greatest wrestling match ever is not the greatest wrestling match ever. But hey, that's just my opinion.